There's a quiet joke among old money families, rarely said out loud, but widely understood. You can always tell. Not from the size of someone's house, not from the model of their car or the label stitched to the outside of their jacket. You can tell from something much smaller, how quickly they mention what something cost, whether they've written a thank you note by hand, whether they know which fork to pick up first without glancing at anyone else's plate. This gap between having wealth and knowing how to carry it is one of the oldest, most studied divides in sociology, and it has a name far more precise than class snobbery. Today, we're breaking down exactly what separates old money etiquette from new money display. The academic theory behind it, the specific rules that still operate today, and the century-old history of why so many of these rules exist in the first place. If you want the real mechanics behind social class, not the stereotypes, the actual documented signaling systems, subscribe now. This channel decodes generational wealth culture every week. The theory, why manners are a currency. To understand why etiquette functions as a class marker at all, we need one piece of academic vocabulary from French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu, whose 1979 book Distinction remains the foundational text on this subject. Bourdieu identified several forms of what he called cultural capital, and the most relevant one here is what he termed embodied cultural capital, knowledge and skill acquired through upbringing, expressed through a person's manners, etiquette, vocabulary, and even accent. This is distinct from money itself. It's knowledge that lives in the body, how you hold a fork, how quickly you rise to greet someone, how you phrase a refusal, and it's transmitted almost entirely through immersion in a family and social environment, not through a class you can enroll in as an adult. Bourdieu argued that family plays the central role in acquiring this kind of capital. A wealthy family can support a child's education abroad or entry into an exclusive school in order to acquire prestigious credentials. But embodied cultural capital specifically includes the simple daily training of behavior and etiquette. A young person taught to be polite to elders, for instance, is absorbing a kind of education that is not the same as anything learned in a classroom. Bourdieu's own summary of what all this achieves is worth quoting directly, because it's unusually precise for an academic sentence. Taste classifies, and it classifies the classifier. In other words, the judgments we make about what's tasteful or crude aren't neutral opinions. They're a way of asserting our own place in a social hierarchy every time we make them. This is precisely the gap that separates old money from new money in the popular imagination. New wealth typically arrives with economic capital fully formed. The bank balance is real and substantial, but embodied cultural capital, the unconscious fluency in a specific set of social codes, takes years, sometimes generations, to build. Over time, social advantages, like knowing how to speak confidently, dress appropriately, or navigate elite institutions, become second nature, what Bourdieu called habitus, a deeply internalized feel for the game that guides behavior without conscious thought, shaped entirely by upbringing and social environment. This is why etiquette rules that look, on the surface, almost comically arbitrary. Which fork, which shade of white, which envelope flap goes where, actually function as an extremely efficient filter. They're nearly impossible to fake, convincingly under pressure, because they were never designed to be learned quickly. They were designed to be absorbed slowly over an entire childhood, which is exactly why they're still such a reliable signal of how long a family has occupied a particular social position. not merely how much money currently sits in its accounts. This is the kind of mechanism-first breakdown this channel exists for. If this framework is clicking for you, drop a comment with the word habitus. It tells me you want more of these deep dives into the real sociology behind old money culture. Why the rules were invented, the Gilded Age panic. Here's something most people don't realize. Many of the etiquette rules we associate with old money weren't ancient traditions at all. A significant number of them were invented, quite deliberately, in a specific decade by people who felt genuinely threatened. Emily Post's book Etiquette, first published in 1922, during the Roaring Twenties, spoke to both the old money elite and the newly wealthy, upwardly mobile middle class alike. This mattered because a wave of resentment from established families toward the parvenus, the new arrivals, had intensified a few decades earlier, during the Gilded Age, when a wave of new industrialists made enormous fortunes seemingly overnight. The established elite's response wasn't to simply ignore the new money. It was to build a wall out of behavior instead of bank balances. In order to distinguish themselves from the nouveau riche, the old elite established a series of elaborate and arbitrary norms, specifically designed to show explicitly who was in and who was out. One surviving holdover from this exact era is the "no white after Labor Day" rule, a fashion convention with no practical basis whatsoever, invented purely as a marker that separated people who already knew the unwritten calendar from people who had to be told. This detail changes how you should understand nearly every arbitrary old money rule you'll ever encounter. The arbitrariness is the point. A rule with a practical function can be learned quickly by anyone motivated enough to learn it. A rule with no practical function at all can only be absorbed by osmosis, over years, inside a social environment that already practices it, which makes it a far more reliable filter for how long has this family actually been here, rather than how much money does this family currently have. Post herself was scathing about the failure mode. What happens when someone acquires money but hasn't absorbed the accompanying behavioral code? She described a certain kind of mansion, one with coarse lace and a door answered at 11 in the morning by a butler in an ill-fitting dress suit and wearing a mustache, as being effectively placarded. Here lives a vulgarian who has never had an opportunity to acquire cultivation. Notice the phrase, not who lacks money, but who has never had an opportunity to acquire cultivation. Post's whole framework treated etiquette as a skill set, learnable in principle, but almost never actually learned quickly by someone encountering it for the first time as an adult. She was equally sharp about the reverse failure: old money behaving badly toward everyone else. Post recommended readers simply ignore elephants at large in the garden, her memorable phrase for wealthy know-it-alls, writing, "Why a man, because he has millions, should assume they confer omniscience in all branches of knowledge is something which may be left to the psychologist to answer." Even the original architect of American etiquette understood that money and character were entirely separate categories, a nuance that's frequently lost in modern conversations about old money manners. Money screams, wealth whispers, the logo problem. Let's move from history into the present, because this next rule shows up constantly in modern research, and it has a genuinely surprising twist buried inside it. Economist Thorstein Veblen gave this whole subject its founding vocabulary back in 1899. In The Theory of the Leisure Class, Veblen coined the term conspicuous consumption to describe the deliberate purchase and public display of luxury goods, specifically as a signal of economic power to onlookers. For over a century, the assumption was straightforward. The richer you are, the louder your spending gets. Bigger houses, brighter logos, flashier cars. But a 2018 research paper out of USC complicated that assumption in a way that maps directly onto the old money versus new money divide. The paper found that the very richest tier of consumers is, counterintuitively, the least concerned with conspicuous consumption. Instead, that group subtly buys quality goods specifically to signal, horizontally, to other members of their own class, using cues invisible to everyone outside it. The researchers gave this a memorable framework. High wealth, paired with a low need to show status, describes old money and the establishment, genuinely very rich, but actively avoiding obvious signals of wealth in favor of subtle cues recognizable mainly to fellow insiders. High wealth paired with a high need to show status, by contrast, describes new money and social climbers, the group most drawn to visibly branded, logo-forward luxury goods. Here's the detail from that same research that surprises almost everyone. The most expensive items within a given luxury brand's own product line frequently carry the least visible branding, while the brand's cheaper items are often covered in obvious logos. The most expensive Gucci and Chanel handbags typically have far less conspicuous branding than the less expensive versions of the exact same bag. The logo isn't scaling up with the price, it's scaling down. The brand itself has learned to sell two different products under one name. A loud version for people who need the world to recognize the brand, and a quiet version for people who only need people already inside that world to recognize it. This pattern has an entire modern fashion movement built around it. Researchers describe a documented generational shift from displaying wealth for the sake of wealth toward a more meaningful expression built on discretion and authenticity. This has produced what's now called quiet luxury, or silent branding, where exclusivity is communicated through cut, fabric, and craftsmanship legible only to people already inside the same economic tier, rather than through a recognizable emblem stamped on the outside. There's a specific historical pattern behind why this trend resurfaces exactly when it does. The very rich have consistently shifted toward inconspicuous consumption whenever the broader political mood turns against visible wealth. The Great Depression produced one wave of it, and the recessions of the early 1970s and early 1990s produced others. Quiet luxury, in other words, isn't simply an aesthetic preference. It's a defensive posture the wealthy have adopted repeatedly across a century whenever visible wealth becomes socially or politically risky to display. The phrase that's come to summarize this entire principle is now widely repeated across fashion and etiquette commentary alike. Money screams, wealth whispers. A logo has to shout because it's speaking to strangers who need the message spelled out. A specific weave of fabric, a particular quality of stitching, a bag with the maker's mark hidden on the inside. These only need to speak to the small number of people already fluent enough to notice, which is precisely the audience old money has always cared most about impressing. If you're finding this reframes how you look at luxury branding entirely, that's exactly the goal of this channel. Subscribe so the rest of this series doesn't get lost in your feed. The handwritten word, why correspondence still matters. If clothing is the etiquette rule most people notice, correspondence is the one that quietly does the most social work, and it's still governed by remarkably specific documented conventions today. The core rule, according to the Emily Post Institute, which has issued authoritative American etiquette guidance for over a century, is simple to state and surprisingly demanding to actually follow. Every gift, whether a tangible object, money, an event held in your honor, or a gift of time and talent, should be acknowledged in writing, and that acknowledgement should be prompt. Handwritten notes are considered warmer and more personal than a phone call or an email, and are treated as second only to thanking someone in person. The general rule: if you open a gift in the presence of the giver and thank them sincerely on the spot, a follow-up note becomes optional. But if the giver wasn't present, a written note is expected. The specificity of the guidance is itself revealing. Contrary to popular myth, there is no year-long grace period for something like wedding thank yous. Notes should be written within 3 months of receiving a gift, ideally the same day, and etiquette guidance explicitly rules out fill-in-the-blank cards, pre-printed cards, phone calls, emails, or a generic thank you posted to a wedding website. The specific instructions go further still. Mail a handwritten note to each person individually, never a form letter with just a signature added, and be sincere enough to mention the actual gift and how it will be used. Why does this specific, labor-intensive convention persist so stubbornly well into an era of instant digital communication? Because, exactly like the no white after Labor Day rule from the Gilded Age, its inconvenience is the message. A handwritten note requires the sender to have been taught, years earlier, that this is simply what one does, and to have absorbed the habit deeply enough that it survives even during an exhausting, chaotic period, like planning a wedding, when a couple might owe over 100 individual notes. And etiquette guidance still insists on writing 5 personalized notes a night, rather than a single mass thank you. Anyone can type "thanks so much" in 4 seconds. Almost nobody can convincingly fake a lifetime habit of unhurried, individually composed correspondence, which is exactly what makes it such a durable, quiet signal of upbringing. There's a broader etiquette principle buried inside this specific rule, one that governs far more than just thank you notes. The effort itself is the content of the message. A handwritten note communicates, before a single word is even read, that the sender considered the recipient worth a specific, non-transferable investment of time. This is the same logic underlying nearly every old money etiquette rule in this video. The value isn't really in the object or the action itself. It's in the visible evidence of time, attention, and training behind it. The art of not asking. Money as an unmentionable topic. There's a companion rule to the handwritten note convention, one that governs conversation rather than correspondence, and it's arguably the single most consistent etiquette marker across old money households. You simply do not ask what things cost, and you certainly do not volunteer what your own things cost. This isn't a rule about secrecy or suspicion. We've covered the deeper financial privacy logic behind old money's silence around net worth in an earlier video on this channel. In a social, in-person setting, this rule operates more simply, almost as a form of basic hospitality, asking a host what their home cost, or a guest what their watch cost, forces the other person into an uncomfortable choice between an awkward dodge and an awkward disclosure. A well-mannered guest simply removes that choice from the table entirely by never posing the question in the first place. The same logic governs conversation about the price of gifts, salaries, tuition, inheritance, or virtually any dollar figure attached to another person's life. Compliments are offered on taste, craftsmanship, or thoughtfulness, never accompanied by a guess at the price tag, and never followed by, "How much did that cost?" This single habit, repeated consistently across a lifetime, does an enormous amount of quiet social work. It signals that the speaker's attention is on the person and the object's quality, not on the transaction that produced it, which, in the framework we opened this video with, is a textbook example of embodied cultural capital in action. Nobody teaches this rule in a single lesson. It's absorbed by watching hundreds of dinner conversations where the subject simply never comes up. The flip side of this rule matters just as much. Old money etiquette treats visible awe at wealth as a lapse in manners, not a compliment. A guest who audibly marvels at a painting's presumed value or asks pointed questions about how a family affords a particular lifestyle is understood, inside this specific social code, to have revealed themselves as an outsider to the code, regardless of their own bank balance. The correct response to visible wealth inside this etiquette system is the same measured, slightly understated register used for everything else: acknowledgement without astonishment. This is the part of old money etiquette that rarely gets explained clearly, the conversational discipline running underneath all the visible rules. If you want the mechanism first version of this world every week, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. The guest's code, hosting, visiting, and the art of not being a burden. The final cluster of rules governs one of the oldest social rituals in any wealthy household. What happens when you're a guest, whether for an afternoon or a weekend? The core principle here is consistent with everything discussed so far. A guest's job is to generate as little friction as possible while leaving clear, specific evidence of gratitude behind. This shows up in small, learnable, but rarely taught conventions, arriving with a hostess gift rather than empty-handed, but choosing something modest and consumable, wine, flowers, a small box of good chocolate, rather than something large or attention-drawing, which would put pressure on the host to react to it in the moment. It shows up in punctuality, arriving at the stated time, not fashionably late, and never significantly early either, since early arrival can catch a host mid-preparation. And it shows up, again, in correspondence. Etiquette guidance is explicit that anyone who hosts a party or an overnight stay should receive an individual, prompt, handwritten note, ideally sent within a couple of days of the visit, not folded into a group thank you or delayed indefinitely. There's a subtler rule embedded in old money hospitality that new money hosting sometimes misses entirely. The best-mannered host makes hospitality look effortless, and the best-mannered guest never points out how much effort clearly went into it. Commenting loudly on how much a host must have spent on a dinner or how elaborate the preparations obviously were breaks the same unspoken rule discussed in the previous section. It draws attention to the transaction underneath the gesture rather than the gesture itself. The correct response to an elaborate, obviously expensive evening is the same measured warmth used for everything else. Genuine, specific thanks for the experience, never a running tally of what it must have cost to produce. This entire cluster of guest and host conventions circles back to the same underlying principle running through this whole video. Etiquette in old money culture functions as a continuous low-stakes demonstration that you were raised to consider other people's comfort automatically without needing to be told. None of these rules are complicated in isolation. A hostess gift, a prompt note, a quiet departure, any single one of them could be picked up from a book in an afternoon. What can't be picked up in an afternoon is the seamless, unconscious fluency in performing all of them simultaneously, under real social pressure, without visibly thinking about any of them at all, which is exactly the quality Bourdieu's theory, back at the start of this video, described as habitus. Here's what ties every rule in this video together. Almost none of them require money at all. A thank you note costs the price of a stamp. Not asking what something cost requires nothing but restraint. Choosing a modest hostess gift over an expensive one is, if anything, cheaper than the alternative. What separates old money etiquette from new money display isn't a bigger budget for manners. It's time, the years it takes for a rule to move from something you were taught to something you no longer have to think about at all. That's the real final distinction underneath everything covered today. New money can buy almost anything old money has. The one thing it cannot buy is the decades of quiet repetition that make a code of behavior invisible, automatic, and entirely unconscious. Old money doesn't just preserve its capital and its behavioral codes as two separate projects. It treats them as the same project because the manners ultimately are what decide who gets access to the rooms where the capital actually gets discussed. If this changed how you look at luxury, correspondence, and conversation, subscribe to Old Money Opulence. New investigations into the real architecture behind generational wealth culture drop every week. And if you want to see how this same discipline gets taught to the next generation before it ever becomes second nature, watch the video. The Silent Rules. Every old money heir learns before age 18 breaks down exactly when and how this etiquette curriculum actually gets installed. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.